stop and remember the cross, and to remember the resurrection, to see the power and wisdom of God in what you've done. So as we go forward in singing, Lord, lead us into your presence. Lead us there where we can see the cross. We can see the sacrifice you gave. We can see the victory that you've won. And we can see how you're making all things new. Open our eyes and wonder to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
to not only learn the Word of God, but live it out. But in order for us to learn how to live out the Bible today, there's a lot of interpretive work that we need to do. And one of the most important pieces for interpreting the Bible is context. So tonight, I want to give you some context on Paul's letters to the Corinthians to help you make more sense of Tom's talk this morning and to prepare you for Matt's talk tomorrow morning on 2 Corinthians. Next slide. This is a recreation of the ancient city of Corinth. And since I think it's important to cite my sources as an academic, a lot of the content from my talk has come from Reading Romans in Pompeii by Peter Oakes, by a couple books by Scott McKnight, Fellowship of Difference, and Pastor Paul, Phoebe by Paula Gooder, and Our Mother St. Paul by Beverly Gaventa, and also some work by Mark Moscow, and rather random Googling. I'm not going to give you my full footnotes. So ancient Corinth was one of the most important Greek cities. Even in 400 BC, it had about 900,000 people. Sorry, 90,000 people. 90,000 people. It was a large, important Greek city. The Romans actually demolished it in 146 BC, and then they rebuilt it in 44 BC, and they made it the capital of the Greek province. So about 80 years later, Paul went to visit it, 90 years later. Paul went to visit it when Gallio was the proconsul, and he was the brother of Seneca. So that actually helps us date the book of Acts pretty accurately at that point, because Acts chapter 18 gives a very clear time range of when Paul was in Corinth. Next slide. So this is the sign to modern-day Corinth, which is a few kilometers away from where the old city of Corinth was, because the ruins now still stand where the old city was. Next slide. So this is the archaeological site of the old city of Corinth. There are more impressive parts that I'll show you in a minute, but that's kind of giving you an idea of part of what remains of the old city. I was there in June on a study trip with my seminary cohort when we did a trip that followed Paul's footsteps around the Mediterranean. So Paul was there for about 18 months in Corinth, and he met his friends Prisca and Aquila there, and then they went on to travel with him. And they pop up all over the rest of the New Testament. They were very mobile missionaries after they met Paul in Corinth. And actually they were originally from Rome, but they got kicked out of Rome when Claudius kicked out all the Jews, and they went to Corinth and then eventually ended up back in Rome. Next slide. This is taken from on top of the Bema, which was sort of the tribunal spot, the judgment seat. And this is where Paul gets himself in a little bit of trouble and then tries to get himself out of trouble. So it was probably in between 51 to 52 that Paul was on trial at the Bema. And you can show the next slide, which is the front of the Bema. So if we can find Matt a Bible, he's going to read from Acts 18. Acts 18, verses 1 through 19, and picture the scene being here.
Then Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he became acquainted with a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently arrived from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They had left Italy when Claudius Caesar deported all Jews from Rome. And Paul lived and worked there, for they were tent makers just as he was. And each Sabbath found Paul at the synagogue, trying to convince the Jews and Greeks alike. And after Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul spent all his time preaching the word. He testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed and insulted him, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, "Your blood is upon your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go preach to the Gentiles." Then he left and went to the home of Titius Justus, a Gentile who worshipped God and lived next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, and everyone in his household believed in the Lord. Many others in Corinth also heard Paul and became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and told him, "Don't be afraid. Speak out. Don't be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack and harm you, for many people in this city belong to me." So Paul stayed there for the next year and a half, teaching the word of God. But when Gallio became governor of Achaia, some Jews rose up together against Paul and brought him before the governor for judgment. They accused Paul of persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to our law. But just as Paul started to make his defense, Gallio turned to Paul's accusers and said, "Listen, you Jews, if this were a case involving some wrongdoing or a serious crime, I would have a reason to accept your case. But since it is merely a question of words and names in your Jewish law, take care of it yourselves. I refuse to judge such matters." And he threw them out of the courtroom. The crowd then grabbed Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and beat him right there in the courtroom. But Gallio paid no attention. To 19?
19.
Paul stayed in Corinth for some time after that, then said goodbye to the brothers and sisters and went to nearby Centuria. There he shaved his head according to Jewish custom, marking the end of a vow. Then he set sail for Syria, taking Priscilla and Aquila with him. They stopped first at the port of Ephesus, where Paul left the others behind. While he was there, he went to the synagogue to reason with the Jews.
Next slide. This is my seminary cohort in front of the Bema, posing like we're part of the statues from the Parthenon. And we didn't know that this was highly inappropriate behavior, and our tour guide got really, really mad at us for taking this picture. We apparently embarrassed her in front of all of her tour guide friends by being the big group that was taking an awkward picture in front of their holy site. Yeah, hashtag worth it. It totally was. Next slide. So this is the Temple of Apollo in Corinth. And Apollo was one of the gods who was worshipped there, and he had a big temple there. Next slide. So this is going down the hill from the ruins of Corinth, down the road that would have been lined with statues of famous people, down to a place with inscriptions in the ground, which I will show you one of those in just a moment. And the statues that lined this road were representative of the cursus honorum, the course of honor, the path of honor. This whole path that was set out for young Corinthian men where they could advance in political positions and gradually work their way up and gain honor for themselves. And there were various things you could do to gain honor, such as military victories or donating a lot of money to the city and get a statue with your face on it and sort of your body. But the thing was, eventually they ran out of room for the statues. So then they would start to just chip off the old face, and then they would sculpt a new face. So you might end up with, someone's body who didn't quite match your own, but there you were on the cursus honorum. The next slide is sideways. Sorry, something went wrong and we can't get it flipped. Anyway, if you turn your heads, you can see the Acrocorin, which was the big hill above the city ruin, and it was called the most impressive Acropolis in Greece. So there was a city up on top of the hill. An Acropolis is just a high city, and this was a defensive point for a long time throughout history. Next slide. Okay, this picture, actually, if you want to take a picture of this and submit it for your scavenger hunt of upside down, you could, because it is upside down, because I was standing on the wrong side of the inscription, because it was roped off and I couldn't get around to the other way. So this is an inscription about Erastus. Could someone look up and read Romans 16:23? Okay.
Romans 16:23. Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus greets you.
So this inscription is about Erastus, the city treasurer, and it says something along the lines of, Erastus paved this with his own money. So he was well known for his benevolence to the city and his official position, and he had an inscription about him there in Corinth. Next slide. These are the cats in Mycena. There were cats everywhere in Turkey and Greece, which was honestly one of my favorite parts of the trip. And this has no biblical value at all. Just, I would take breakfast food from the hotel bar and carry it around with me, and then every time we saw cats, I would feed them. So these are the cats in Mycena, which is a few kilometers away from Corinth, which is an old ancient Greek site, and that's the next slide, Daniel. This is the view from the top of a hill that we hiked up in Mycena. And the ancient city of Mycenae and some of the incredibly old ruins they have there date back to Abraham's time. So while Abraham was doing his journey around making his covenant with God, the Greeks were building this settlement here on this hill. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what the landscape looks like as Paul and his friends were walking around Corinth. This is the scrubby, dusty roads and the little bushes and olive trees and things that they were walking past. Next slide. So this is kind of a timeline, and different scholars have different opinions because some of it is hard to date exactly when Paul wrote his letters and when he was where. We're pretty sure we know when he was in Corinth because of the public figures named. So it's probable that he was in Corinth for those 18 months there, and that's the story in Acts 18. Then he went to Ephesus and some other places, and that's in Acts 19. Oh, end of Acts 18, beginning of Acts 19. While he was in Ephesus, it's likely that's when he wrote his letters to the Corinthians. And the next slide is a map. We'll go to it in just a moment. Paul probably wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians. We only have 2 of them. The other ones are lost. The 2 that we have, so 1 Corinthians is probably the second letter that he wrote. And 2 Corinthians is actually probably the 4th letter. And it's possible there was a visit in between some of those letters. A lot of different theories about this, but what he refers to in the letters, it seems like there were these ongoing conversations, and there must have been more letters to explain what was going on. Then he went back to Corinth, and either staying in Corinth or in the seaport nearby of Cenchrea is probably when he wrote his letter to Rome, because Phoebe was a deacon of the church in Cenchrea, and she's the one who probably paid for and then carried his letter to the Romans. So the letter departed for Rome, probably from the seaport of Cenchrea. So he might have written it from Gaius' house in Corinth or Phoebe's house in Cenchrea. Next slide. So here's the map. Here's Corinth. Here's Ephesus. And here's Philippi. So when Silas and Timothy come down from Macedonia, they're coming down here. And then when Paul sails over to Ephesus, go around that way. Next slide. So they sail across the Aegean Sea. And the next slide is stuck. The Aegean Sea. There we go. There it is. Okay. This is the Aegean Sea from the port of Cenchrea. It was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. But the ruins at Cenchrea are nothing because the ocean has come in, and so most of the ruins are underwater. So it's not even protected. There's like this dilapidated chain link fence that you just walk around to get down to the ruins. And you can't really see, but over to that side, there's these little like cabanas, and people were just swimming. It's just like a public swimming beach with like an ice cream stand. That's the ruins of Cenchrea. The next slide is an aerial map of Cenchrea. So you can see beach cabanas for swimming, ancient Cenchrea. So you just walk down and you can go out and stand on the rocks in the water. I would love, if I ever became independently wealthy, I would love to fund the excavation of Cenchrea and actually make it like a proper archaeological site. I don't know, it's kind of a toss-up between Cenchrea and Colossae. I'd like to excavate both of them. So you can see the outlines of the city, and I just read another article recently about a temple outline that they've seen with aerial imaging, and it's hard to get down to all this stuff because it's under the water. Okay, next slide.
The Dutch can dam it.
That's a really good point. The Dutch could make land out of that and then make it excavated. We just need some Dutch engineers. Okay, so this is Phoebe standing on the ruins of Cenchrea. My seminary cohort made a stop there because of me. It's a nothing site, so the tour company did not want to take us the several kilometers outside of Corinth to go to Cenchrea. And they kept saying, there's nothing to see there, it's all underwater. But Dr. McKnight insisted until they finally agreed to go to Cenchrea just for me, because I really wanted to read my class my story about Phoebe in Cenchrea. So they did, and you guys, it was one of the best experiences of my life. To be there, to be standing there in the ruins of Phoebe's home, to speak the story about her and Paul that I wrote, and to share this context with my cohort. It was really incredible. Next slide. Sideways. We can just, another picture. We can just skip on right by that one. Go to the next slide. So, I would like to take us all into a house church in Corinth for the rest of our evening session. You've got some context on the city and the things that were going on. One last point about which the city culture that Paul is speaking to is this issue of status. It was a city of a lot of freed slaves. It was a city where, because it was an important city, it was a capital city, it was important for people to present a good image of themselves, to show their status with their clothes, with the statues, with the engravings, and to be good at rhetoric, to speak well, to be a good orator. And if you didn't have a statue of yourself, it was important for you to align yourself with leaders of status. So that's why Paul's arguing with them about saying, I'm with Apollos. Like, I align myself with Apollos because he was a well-known Christian teacher. So they were taking their culture and then bringing it into their Christianity and making their Christian relationships about status and aligning themselves with well-known Christian leaders. They were just Christianizing their pagan culture. And so Paul basically defied all of that. He was an ugly dude. Based on all of the early descriptions of him and the early church art, he was short, he was bald, he was bow-legged, he had a unibrow, he had a red face. He was not an attractive man. And so for a city full of statues of perfect specimens and the temple to Apollo and people walking around with their fine clothes, Paul shows up and he embarrassed them. And it actually makes me think of how we embarrassed our tour guide by acting inappropriately. But Paul embarrassed the Corinthian church because here was this great apostle and this leader, but he dressed funny. He wasn't necessarily a great or compelling speaker. He wasn't the best at rhetoric. And he worked with his hands, which was probably the most embarrassing point. He was a teacher and he could have made money from teaching and speaking, but he chose to humble himself and to continue working with his hands even while he was preaching and teaching them. So he just defied all of their ideas about status, and he lived out the example of humbling himself to show them how they needed to turn their culture upside down and be worried about serving each other instead of being worried about getting a statue made with their face on it. Paul embarrassed them, but he loved them. And I think in spite of all of the frustration that you hear in the letters, I think he did develop a deep love relationship with them. He cared for them like a pastor. He loved them like a mother and a father. And in these letters, there's imagery of him feeling maternal about them, as well as feeling paternal about them. He cared about them as a parent. And actually, his using maternal imagery was probably another thing that embarrassed them, because he was lowering himself to compare himself to a woman. But he did, because he loved them like a mom. So let's go into what a first century or second century house church meeting in Corinth might have looked like. We showed this slide last Sunday. This is the sort of inner courtyard of a large villa in Pompeii. So there were certainly houses of this size in Corinth. And so Gaius' house, for example, could have been this size. And you could fit 30, probably even up to 50 people for a house church meeting in Gaius' house or in other large villas like this. And then the next slide is an indoor-outdoor garden, which would have given even more space. And it's part of the same villa. So you could fit a lot of people into some of these larger homes, but not a ton. I mean, there wasn't as much space as we have at the Met on a Sunday morning, for example. So a house church was probably about 30 people or fewer, maybe 15, especially if they met in a tenement apartment, maybe 10, as many as they could fit in the living room. We have the problem with our small groups now where some houses can't fit more than 8 people comfortably in the living room, and the early house churches had the same problem. So let's say that we have a 30-person house church, which is about the right size. I think we've got 31 people here. And let's talk about the people who are in this church. So you've all got name tags, and you're all going to become characters. First of all, we have, so we're meeting in a craft worker's house, and the workshop is over there. We've sort of moved everything aside so that we have room for our meeting. Now, the craft worker's wife is our hostess. Now, Christine is a woman of status. a woman of status, but because there was a demographic problem in the early church. So in a lot of Roman cities, there were more men than women. So say for every 100 women, 140 men. Because of infanticide of female babies and because of women dying in childbirth. So not very many women comparatively. But in the church, it was different. So even with that gender imbalance in the church, there were a lot of women. It was even described as the religion of slaves and women, derisively. Because slaves and women found status in the church that they didn't find outside of the church. So this was a problem because how are all of these Christian women going to find Christian husbands when men of status are not interested in the church? So sometimes they had to marry slaves, and those marriages were illegal. But Tertullian and other early church fathers tried to encourage women of status to marry men of lower status. But if those marriages were illegal, they couldn't legally get married. So the church kind of looked the other way and blessed concubinage, which was living together but not being legally married. So here's our craft worker's husband, former slave, now married to a woman of status.
I'm married up.
So they also have some kids running around who happen to be in the other room right now. But we also have the craft worker's dependent relative living with them, and a tenant living with them. So she's renting space. She happens to be Jewish. The craft worker, they're Gentiles. Another tenant who's also renting space. Let's see, what can I make you? Josh is a male prostitute. Stephanie is a female prostitute. We've got a female prostitute today. We've got now tenant number one over there has a dependent relative. She's Jewish also. Their whole household is Jewish. They're renting space. Now we've got you.
Oh, that was funny.
You are the wife of a rich householder who lives somewhere else in Corinth. Your husband is not a believer. So he still worships at the Temple of Apollo. He actually has idols of Apollo in your house, and you're very uncomfortable with this. But you're a rich man's wife, rich householder's wife, and you have, I need a boy. That's too many names here. Okay, I need a boy. Okay. You are the rich householder's son.
Oh, yes.
Okay, your son. And you are the rich householder's daughter. So son, daughter, mom are Christians. Dad's not a Christian. This is causing a lot of tension in their home. Okay. Now Rosie is an unattached slave. She's not the slave of anyone here. She just learned about Jesus and she's been coming to the church and she loves that she's welcomed in even though she's just a slave. We've got unattached slave number 2 here. Now, we've got a freed slave. Now, Alicera has bought her freedom, so she now works for herself because she's a skilled craftsperson and she's bought her freedom. Okay. Those are empty. We can vote that one. Okay. Now we've got Crispus. We don't have enough guys. If you don't mind being Crispus, you are a Corinthian of high status. Okay, you're very important. You are Stephanos. You are another Corinthian of high status. Okay. Now we've got a migrant worker here. Wow. Okay, so you are just traveling through Corinth. You happen to be here briefly. You're a follower of Jesus, and so you heard about the church meeting and you want to come here. Okay, now we've got a homeless guest who is depending on the hospitality of our craft worker's wife here. And she's Jewish, she's homeless, and so they've invited her to live with them temporarily. We've got another homeless guest here. She's not Jewish, okay? You guys are living together. Now we've got a Jewish tradesperson. We've got a Jewish tradesperson back here. Okay, he's working a trade. Now, we've got our craft worker and his wife, even though they're Christians, they have slaves. So, craft workers, male slave number 1. Don't laugh too hard. Craft worker, slave number 2. Okay, so you are slaves who work here in the household, and yet during the meetings, you are equals with your master. Okay, over there, tenant number 2, you're tenant number 2 slave. So you live here temporarily while they're renting space here from them. Okay. Now we've got Gaius, a very, very important person. Okay, Erastus, there we go. City treasurer.
Oh.
There we go. Okay.
Written in stone.
Okay. Now you are the slave of tenant number 1, and you are also Jewish because, as I said, their whole household is Jewish. Now we might also have another unattached slave, another dependent relative, another craft worker. Oh, I missed them. That's why I'm running out. I skipped you guys, and I found Erastus. There we go, Erastus. And unattached slave, you come here on your own, and a Jewish craft worker. Okay. Now, okay. Now, think about the long day that you've all had working your trade, serving in the household, managing the household, the prostitutes are thinking about their day at the brothel or the bathhouse, maybe. And so you come here, you're hungry and you're tired, and you've been welcomed in. Now, would all of the Gentiles sit down? If your name tag says Jewish, then you're a Jew. If you are a Gentile, sit down. The Gentiles are sitting down. You're a Gentile. If it doesn't specifically say you're Jewish, yes. If it doesn't say Jewish, you have to, yeah, there we go. Okay. Now, Christianity started as a Jewish sect. But as it progressed and more Gentiles were brought in, that was Paul's whole mission, we had more and more Gentiles in the church. So you can see that the majority of this church is Gentile, and the Jews have become the minority. Now that's important to remember when you're reading Romans, because it was the same case in Rome, where the majority was Gentile and the minority were Jewish. And so when you read Romans 14 and 15, and the talk about the strong and the weak, it's talking about the weak, those who don't have social status, the Jews, and the strong, the Gentiles who have the social power. And so their conflicts over food and judging each other stem from this difference and this prejudice. Okay, now everyone can sit down, the Jews included. And we are going to celebrate 1st century or 2nd century liturgy. So we've all come, we've all gathered. And now it's time for me to say, hi, my name is Phoebe. I'm the deacon of the church in Cancria. Thank you so much for letting me come to your house and to worship with you this evening. And I'm so grateful to our hostess and our host, who normally lead the church here in their home, Buddha, who have allowed me to preside over our love feast tonight because of my church leadership role in Cancria. Thank you very much for having me. I will say a greeting, and then you all can repeat it back to me. I'll give you your line. So I will say, the Lord be with you, and you say, and also with you. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Now we would love to hear from the Hebrew Scriptures. Would one of our Jewish brothers or sisters read to us from the Exodus? Would one of our Jewish brothers or sisters be willing to read to us? Are you? Okay, we've got a Jewish sister here. We have a Jewish sister here because these are her scriptures, and we have been grafted into the tree of Israel as Gentiles, but we would love to hear you tell the story that we are brought into. Would you read Exodus 12, 1 through 14?
1 to 14.
1 to 14. Exodus 12, 1 through 14.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people they are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the side and top of the door frames of the house where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread and made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On the same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord."
And would another of our Jewish sisters or brothers read us from the Psalms? Psalm 114.
When the Israelites escaped from Egypt, when the family of Jacob left that foreign land, the land of Judah became God's sanctuary, and Israel became his kingdom. The Red Sea saw them coming and hurried out of their way. The water of the Jordan River turned away. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. What's wrong, Red Sea, that made you hurry out of their way? What happened, Jordan River, that you turned away? Why, mountains, did you skip like rams? Why, hills like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. He turned the rock into a pool of water. Yes, a spring of water flowed from solid rock.
Now we have the incredible privilege of having some people in our midst who can recite from the memoirs of the apostles. Would someone who has the story of John be willing to recite that for us? Anyone who has a Bible and feels like turning to the Gospel of John? In other words, the Gospels were probably not written down at this point, and so they were passed on through oral tradition. And so remembering the memoirs of the apostles was really important for the early church. And now, Phoebe probably didn't know John because I don't think that she ever made it over to Ephesus. But John and Priscilla and Aquila and Paul, all working in Ephesus together, very likely interacted with each other. So I think that the community in Corinth, through those connections, would feel a personal connection with John, who was still possibly alive at the time. So to think of our dear, beloved brother John and his memories of his Lord Jesus. Would someone share with us from John 13?
Which verse?
Verses 1 through 17.
Says, "It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, He loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just wash my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus replied, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet, for their whole body is clean. And are you clean? Though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am." Was it 14 as well?
Through 17.
Oh, okay. "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them."
Can you imagine what it would have been like for them to hear these stories of Jesus just one or two people removed from first-hand accounts? And can someone read Luke 22 for the rest of the narrative about the New Covenant meal? Luke 22, 14 through 20, do you have it?
When the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table. Jesus said, "I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. For I tell you now that I won't eat this meal again until its meaning is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Then he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. Then he said, "Take this and share it amongst yourselves, for I will not drink wine again until the kingdom of God has come." He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you."
If you'll allow me to share a short reflection or teaching, an application on what we read. Of course, as Paul says in his letter to us, it's appropriate for women to cover their heads when they are prophesying or praying. Now, we heard about the Passover meal in the Exodus. And we heard a psalm of deliverance about the Exodus. And then we heard about the new covenant meal, the new Exodus, that Jesus initiated with his disciples, showing that Jesus is the one who brings us out of slavery and into the new promised land, which is to be the new heavens and the new earth in the resurrection. And so we remember this Passover meal that Jesus celebrated with his disciples. And in our love feasts that we have together, we remember this meal. But there's been problems in the ways that we've been practicing it. And we haven't been loving each other with the love that Jesus showed when he washed his disciples' feet. And so I'll repeat to you the reminder that Paul gave us in his letter. "Now I don't praise you as I give the following instruction, because when you meet together, it does more harm than good. First of all, when you meet together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partly believe it. It's necessary that there are groups among you to make it clear who's genuine. So when you get together in one place, it isn't to eat the Lord's meal. Each of you goes ahead and eats in a private meal. One person goes hungry while another one is drunk. Don't you have houses to eat and drink in, or do you look down on God's churches and humiliate those who have nothing? What can I say to you? Will I praise you? No, I don't praise you in this. Those who eat and drink without correctly understanding the body are eating and drinking their own judgments. Because of this, many of you are weak and sick, and quite a few have died. But if we had judged ourselves, we wouldn't be judged. However, we who are disciplined by the Lord, when we are judged, so that we won't be judged and condemned along with the whole world. For these reasons, my brothers and sisters, when you get together to eat, wait for each other. If some of you are hungry, they should be at home, so getting together doesn't lead to judgment. I'll give directions about the other things when I come. So we remember as we go to this meal together that we need to give preference to the poor among us, that we need to not be greedy, that we need to not be like our Corinthian culture, those who give feasts and they eat the best food themselves and they serve their guests and the servants the lesser food. No, we all get the same because we're all equal in God's kingdom. So we remember that as we go into our meal together. But before we go into our dinner, let us sing a hymn. Now, do all of you know the doxology or do you praise God, all blessings flow? Know that we can sing it? Would you lead us in singing? Tenant number 2's dependent slave.